My name is Elias Thorne. For 23 years, the Bitterroot Range has been more than my office. It has been the language I speak, the rhythm to which my heart is set. I have guided men of immense wealth and men of humble means into its deep valleys and onto its high, wind-scarred ridges. I have taught them how to read the subtle calligraphy of a deer trail on damp earth, how to distinguish the warning call of a jay from its idle chatter, and how to feel the turn of the weather in the ache of their own bones. The mountains are a living text, and I am one of its few fluent readers. My clients are, for the most part, predictable archetypes. There are the corporate executives from cities of glass and steel, seeking a week of what they call primal authenticity. They arrive with brand new gear and a romantic notion of conquering nature, and they leave with sore muscles and a humbling realization that the wilderness does not bend to the force of a man's will. There are the fathers and sons navigating the awkward, silent canyons of their own relationships, hoping the shared hardship of the hunt will build a bridge. I can read these men within minutes of meeting them. Their insecurities, their boasts, their quiet hopes. I see the tremor in the hand of a CEO as he chambers his first round, the flicker of pride in a father's eye when his son correctly identifies a track. This knowledge, this intimacy with both the landscape and the men who walk it, has always been my greatest asset. It is the foundation of my control, the bedrock of a confidence earned through thousands of miles on foot and hundreds of nights under the stars. I had come to believe there was no man and no secret of these mountains that I could not eventually understand. That was my first, and perhaps my most dangerous, mistake. The man who would shatter that belief arrived on a Tuesday in late October. The aspens had shed their gold, leaving skeletal, silver branches against the bruised purple of the autumn sky. He didn't arrive in a dusty pickup truck or a practical SUV, but in a black sedan that seemed to absorb the light around it. It crunched to a stop on the gravel outside my office, its polished exterior an offense against the rustic honesty of my world. The man who stepped out was Mr. Alistair Finch. He was tall and unnaturally lean, moving with a stiff, deliberate grace that was at odds with the rugged setting. Everything about him was a study in unsettling perfection. While I wore flannel worn soft with a decade of use and jeans faded at the knees, he was clad in layers of state, of the art technical fabric in muted grays and blacks. It was the best gear money could buy, but it was pristine. His boots, a top of the line model designed for brutal alpine terrain, carried not a single scuff or speck of dust. They looked as if they had been lifted from a display case moments before. He wore his pack not like a familiar burden, but like a piece of calculated ordnance. There was a profound sterility to him, a hyper-competence that was somehow more disturbing than the bumbling of a novice. A novice is unprepared for the wild. Mr. Finch looked as though he had been assembled in a laboratory specifically to dissect it. He was not a man who respected nature. He was a man who intended to impose a cold, alien order upon it. He followed me into my office, his eyes scanning the space with a detached curiosity. The room is my sanctuary, its log walls covered with topographical maps, marked with my own annotations, a few modest trophies from my youth, and the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and gun oil. He ignored it all, his attention settling on me. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice as crisp and devoid of warmth as the air outside. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you know these mountains better than any man alive." "I know their moods," I corrected, gesturing for him to sit. "No man ever truly knows them." He gave a slight, dismissive nod, as if I'd made a quaint, folksy remark. He placed a slim briefcase on my desk and opened it. Inside, instead of contracts or papers, was a satellite map laminated in plastic. His gloved finger tapped a specific location. I wish to engage your services for a 7-day expedition. Our destination is here. I leaned forward, a knot of professional curiosity tightening in my gut. His finger rested on a remote, high-altitude basin known locally as the Silent Cirque. It was a nasty piece of geography, a treacherous, full-day hike beyond the last reliable game trails, ringed by sheer granite cliffs, and known for its sudden, violent weather systems. More importantly, it was a biological dead zone. The elevation was too high, the soil too poor. Serious hunters avoided it for a simple reason: there was nothing there to hunt. "That's a hard climb, Mr. Finch," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "And not much reward at the end of it. The elk and bear stay lower down, in the timberline. The reward is there," he stated, not as a belief, but as a fact. "I am tracking a specific quarry." "And what might that be?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the only break in his composure I had yet seen. "A mature specimen," he said, the words feeling carefully chosen. "An old bull, past its prime. One that needs to be culled from the herd for the health of the ecosystem." The lie was as clean and sterile as his equipment. A man doesn't pay a guide a premium to hunt a specific, lone animal in a place where no herds exist. He doesn't use vague, clinical terms like specimen and cull when he means trophy. My internal alarm, honed by years of reading men, was screaming. I should have shown him the door right then. I should have told him I was booked for the season. But then he named his price. He slid an envelope across the desk. I opened it and saw stacks of $100 bills bound in paper bands. It was 5 times my standard rate for a week-long trip. It was enough to pay off the last of my mortgage, to fix the leaky roof on my cabin, to ensure the quiet retirement I was beginning to dream of. It was enough to make me silence the voice of my own intuition. "I require absolute discretion," he added, his gaze unwavering, "and your assurance that you will follow my instructions to the letter, even if they seem unconventional." Against every instinct, I heard myself agree. I took his money, and in doing so, I sealed a contract whose true terms I could not begin to imagine. The ascent began the next morning before dawn. The air was thin and sharp, each breath a plume of white vapor. Within the first hour, I noticed Finch's stamina. It was inhuman. He moved with a relentless, metronomic rhythm, his feet falling in the exact same pattern, his breathing perfectly even. He never seemed to tire, never broke a sweat. He was less a man hiking than a machine executing a program. More unnerving was his complete lack of interest in the world around him. I was a guide. My purpose was to interpret the wilderness for my client. I pointed out a set of fresh wolf tracks crossing our path, their size indicating a large male. Finch glanced at them without comment. I gestured to the deep, parallel scars a black bear had clawed into the trunk of an ancient pine, a territorial marking. He offered only a cursory nod. I stopped to identify the piercing cry of a goshawk circling high above. He simply stared ahead, his gaze fixed on the rising ridgeline. His senses were not tuned to the signs of life, but to something else entirely. He was a hunter, yes, but not of animals. He seemed to be searching for signs of aberration. He would pause, not at a game trail, but at a patch of woods where the air felt strangely still and the usual chorus of insects was absent. He ran a gloved hand over a lightning scar on a Douglas fir, a jagged black wound that, I now saw, looked less like a natural burn and more like a deliberate, angular symbol. The potential for conductivity is higher here, he murmured to himself, his voice a low hum. He was looking for things that broke the natural order. His perfect, sterile gear and his unnatural focus were two sides of the same coin. He was an intruder, a foreign body seeking not to participate in the ecosystem, but to locate and excise a flaw within it. We made camp that first night in a small meadow, just below the tree line. A nervous tension had settled between us. Thick and suffocating, I built a fire. The crackle and pop of the burning pine a small comfort against the oppressive silence that seemed to emanate from my client. After a sparse meal, which he consumed with the same mechanical efficiency he did everything else, Finch announced he was going to retrieve water from the nearby creek. He disappeared into the gloom, and I was left alone with the fire and my gnawing curiosity. Professionalism warred with a primal need to understand the man with whom I was entrusting my life. The need won. With furtive, guilty movements, I knelt by his pack. I didn't find a hidden weapon or anything overtly sinister. I found things that were far, far stranger. Tucked into a side pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy tuning fork made of a silver, like metal, intricately engraved with symbols that were neither letters nor numbers. Beside it was a thick, leather-bound journal. I opened it to a random page. It was filled not with words, but with impossibly complex astronomical charts, hand-drawn diagrams of what looked like tidal patterns and long, arcane equations. These were not the notes of a hunter. They were the tools of a physicist or perhaps an occultist. In a small, velvet-lined box, I found a set of polished obsidian lenses of varying thicknesses, each one cold to the touch, seeming to drink the firelight from the air. A twig snapped behind me. I dropped the lens back into its box and scrambled back to my side of the fire, my heart hammering against my ribs. Finch emerged from the darkness, moving with a predator's silence. He wasn't carrying any water. His eyes weren't on me, or the pack I had so obviously disturbed. They were fixed on the impenetrable wall of blackness beyond our small circle of light. He didn't seem angry, or even surprised. He seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. He stood there for a long moment, a tall, gray silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Then he spoke, his voice calm, clinical, and utterly terrifying. "Did you feel that, Thorn?" I stared at him, confused. "Feel what?" I didn't feel anything. A thin, cold smile touched his lips, a tremor. Not in the earth. In the resonance. He looked from the darkness to me, his eyes pinning me in place. "The frequency is sharpening. It knows we are here. I am a man who has slept on this ground for 2 decades. I know its every groan, its every shift, the way the rock settles after a hard frost. And I had felt absolutely, unequivocally nothing. In that moment, the last vestiges of my comfortable reality fell away. The premise of our hunt, the lie I had been paid to believe, was gone. My client wasn't hunting animals. And whatever he was hunting, it was now hunting us. Sleep did not come that night. Every gust of wind through the pines sounded like a whisper. Every shadow thrown by the dying fire seemed to wreathe with unnatural life. I sat with my rifle across my lap, its familiar weight a poor substitute for the confidence I had lost. Finch, on the other hand, had unrolled his sleeping bag and laid down with the serene calm of a man clocking out of his shift. His talk of frequency and resonance echoed in my mind, alien concepts that had no place in my world of rock, wind, and animal instinct. "What are you?" I finally asked, my voice a low croak in the vast silence. "What are you really hunting, Finch?" He didn't open his eyes. "I told you. a specimen that needs to be culled. That's not an answer. My frustration was a hot coal in my chest. What was that about resonance? What knows we're here? He was silent for so long I thought he had fallen asleep. Then, his voice came out of the darkness, still maddeningly calm. Imagine, Mr. Thorne, that the world you perceive is a piece of music. It has a rhythm, a harmony. Most of the time, it plays correctly, but sometimes a single note is held too long. It begins to soar. It creates a dissonance that warps the notes around it. If left unchecked, it can unravel the entire composition. He finally turned his head, and even in the gloom I could feel the intensity of his gaze. I am a tuner. I find the SAR note and I silence it. His explanation offered no comfort. It was the detached, metaphorical language of a madman, yet delivered with the conviction of a surgeon discussing a tumor. I was his guide, his local expert, but I was hopelessly out of my depth. The money in my cabin felt like a boat anchor, dragging me down into a cold, dark place from which I might never surface. When dawn finally broke, it brought no relief. The light seemed thin and weak, as if struggling to penetrate the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the mountains. We broke camp in silence and continued our ascent. The land itself began to change. It was no longer the familiar, challenging terrain of the Bitterroots. It was becoming a perversion of it. The first sign was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a remote wilderness, but a dead, pressurized absence of sound. The birds were gone. The chittering of squirrels, the drone of insects, all of it had been erased. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the scree and the unnervingly steady rhythm of Finch's breathing. It felt like we were walking through a photograph of a forest, not the real thing. Then came the visual distortions. We passed through a grove of ancient bristlecone pines, trees that had stood for 1,000 years. But their trunks were twisted at impossible angles, corkscrewing into the earth, as if the force of gravity had become warped and inconsistent around them. A stream that should have tumbled down the mountainside ran sluggishly, and in one spot, for a stretch of about 20 feet, its surface was perfectly, unnaturally still, like a pane of smoked glass. I knelt and touched the water. It was freezing cold, but it had the thick, viscous feel of oil. My role as guide had become a farce. I was no longer leading, I was merely following, a witness to a world that was actively rejecting the laws I had always trusted. My compass, a reliable friend for 2 decades, began to spin lazily, its needle unable to find north. I looked at my topographical map, then at the ridgeline ahead. The peaks were there, but they seemed wrong. A jagged spire I had known my whole life looked subtly blunted, as if seen through a flawed lens. The mountain was losing its definition. Finch, however, seemed energized by these aberrations. He was in his element. He would stop periodically, pull the silver tuning fork from his pack, and strike it against his boot. But it never rang. It would produce a dull, leaden thud, as if the air itself was too thick for sound waves to travel. Each time, he would nod to himself, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. The dissonance is increasing, he'd murmur, making a notation in his leather-bound journal. The decay is accelerating. On several occasions, he would pause, retrieve one of the polished obsidian lenses, and hold it to his eye, scanning the landscape. He never said what he saw, but I could see the change in him. His posture would stiffen, his focus narrowing to a single point. Once, he held the lens up for nearly a full minute, aimed at a sheer rock face half a mile away. When he lowered it, his face was pale. "What is it?" I demanded, my voice tight with dread. "What do you see?" An echo, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A place where it has fed. We reached a small, high-altitude plateau late in the afternoon. And there, we found the first tangible evidence that we were not alone in our journey into madness. In the center of the plateau stood a mule deer, a young doe. She was frozen mid-stride, her head turned, ears pricked, as if listening for a predator. But she wasn't frozen by ice or fear. She was stone. I approached cautiously, my boots sinking into the thin, mossy soil. It was perfect in every detail. The delicate hairs of her coat, the wet sheen of her eye, the slight flare of her nostrils. It was not a statue. It was a creature whose life had been instantly and utterly replaced by something else. I reached out a trembling hand and touched her flank. It was cold, hard, and unnervingly smooth, like polished granite. There was no sign of a struggle, no track of a predator. Just this impossible, silent monument to a moment of interrupted life. What did this? I asked, my voice hollow. A side effect, Finch said, walking a slow circle around the petrified animal. He ran a gloved finger along its stony back. The resonance field is strong here. In moments of high-energy discharge, the local state of matter can become unstable. It seeks a lower energy state. In this case, silicate. He looked at me, his expression clinical. The music stopped for her, Mr. Thorne. Abruptly, the horror of it was profound. This was not a kill. This was an erasure. The thing we were hunting didn't just take life, it rewrote the very substance of reality. The image of the doe, trapped forever in a moment of fear, would be burned into my memory for the rest of my days. We pressed on, the silent cirque now less than a mile away. The air grew colder, and a low, audible hum began to vibrate through the soles of my boots. It was a feeling more than a sound, a deep thrumming that resonated in my bones and made my teeth ache. The world was now a full, blown nightmare. The light had taken on a sickly, greenish tint. The very air seemed to shimmer, like the heat haze above a summer road, but this was a haze that radiated a deep, penetrating cold. We finally crested the last ridge. Below us lay the silent cirque. My breath caught in my throat, a knot of pure, primal fear. The basin was a perfect bowl of gray rock and stunted, dying vegetation. But that wasn't what held my gaze. In the exact center of the cirque, the air was not just shimmering. It was visibly warped. It was a patch of reality, perhaps 50 yards across, that did not belong. It looked like a bubble of flawed, hand-blown glass suspended in the air. Through it, the landscape on the other side was distorted, bent, and smeared. The colors were wrong, sickly violets and oily greens that had no place in nature. It was like looking through a window into a diseased world, a world that was bleeding through into our own. The low hum was emanating from this wound in the world. Finch calmly unslung his pack. He began to assemble a device from components he withdrew, pieces of strange, non-reflective metal and coiled copper wire. He worked with the focused intensity of a bomb disposal expert. "The old bull," I said, my voice shaking as I stared at the shimmering distortion. "That's it, isn't it?" "A localized reality fracture," he corrected, not looking up from his work. "A point where the fundamental constants of this dimension have become unstable. My predecessors called them many things. A nexus, a whisper in the dark, a thin place." He finally looked up from his device, his eyes meeting mine. They held no fear, only a weary resolve. "My metaphor was more accurate than you know, Mr. Thorne. It is old. It is past its prime, and its decay is becoming aggressive." He gestured with his chin towards the shimmering bubble. "It is growing, and it is hungry." As I stared, mesmerized by the awful beauty of the thing. I saw something move within the distortion. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood. It was a ripple, a brief, sickening lurch where the bent landscape within the bubble seemed to fold in on itself like a piece of paper being crumpled. And as it did, the humming intensified, and I felt a wave of profound nausea and vertigo wash over me. The SAR note was getting louder, and it had finally seen its tuners. The moment the fracture recognized our presence, the world tilted on its axis. The low hum that had been a vibration in my bones became a physical force. A wave of pressure that buckled my knees and sent a spike of pain through my skull. The nausea was no longer a gentle swell. It was a violent lurch, and I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, stealing the breath from my lungs. My lifetime of experience in the high altitudes meant nothing. This wasn't a lack of oxygen. It was a rejection of it. "Steady, Mr. Thorne." Finch's voice was sharp, cutting through the roaring in my ears. He hadn't flinched. He continued to assemble his strange contraption. A tripod base, a central cylindrical core, and 3 articulated arms that ended in what looked like polished satellite dishes. "It is testing us, trying to unbalance our equilibrium. Do not let it unbalance." I gasped, clutching my head. "Finch, the whole mountain is screaming." "That is a perception, not a reality," he said, though his knuckles were white as he tightened a final bolt. "It is projecting. It feeds on chaos, and its first act is to create it in the minds of those who approach. Focus on the physical, the rock beneath your feet, the cold on your skin. Anchor yourself to what you know is real." It was easy for him to say. He was a visitor here, a man of equations and sterile instruments. My reality was these mountains, and they were currently twisting themselves into a nightmare. The shimmering bubble in the center of the cirque began to pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat like a diseased heart. With each pulse, the wrongness spread. I watched in horror as a patch of hardy alpine, moss 50 feet from the distortion's edge, bleached to a skeletal white in an instant. A slab of granite flaked away from a cliff face, not falling, but dissolving into a cloud of fine, gray dust before it could even begin to drop. Then came the whispers. They weren't in the wind, they were inside my head. At first, they were just sounds. The crack of a dry twig, the distant boogle of an elk, familiar and comforting. But they began to soar, to twist. The elk's call became a drawn-out, agonized scream. The snap of the twig sounded like a bone breaking. Then came the voices, echoes of my own past. "You should have checked the ropes, Elias." The voice of a client from a decade ago, one who had taken a bad fall on a steep traverse. He had lived, but his accusing eyes had haunted me for months. "Is this all you'll ever be? A mountain hermit?" My ex-wife's voice, laced with the pity and disappointment that had ended our marriage. "It's getting dark. I'm cold." The voice of my younger brother, who had died of pneumonia when we were children, a memory I had buried for 40 years. The fracture was rifling through my soul, pulling out my deepest regrets and failures and waving them in my face. It was an assault far more terrifying than any predator of flesh and blood. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The images were behind my eyes, not in front of them. "It's in my head," I choked out, sinking to one knee. My rifle felt impossibly heavy, a useless piece of steel. "I know." Finch's voice was grim. He had finished his device and was now calibrating it, turning a small dial on its core. "It is reading your resonance, your history. It is looking for a frequency to which you are vulnerable. Fight it. They are only echoes." He looked up from his work, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than cold competence in his eyes. It might have been strain, or it might have been a sliver of fear. It is doing the same to me. He didn't say what the thing was showing him, and I didn't want to know. He took a deep breath, his focus absolute. I am going to attempt to impose a harmonic counter, frequency. It should, in theory, stabilize the membrane and force the dissonance into a state of temporary dormancy. But the initial pulse from the resonator will be violent. The fracture will react defensively. It will try to sever our connection to this plane. He pointed to a spot on the ridge, about 100 yards to our left. I need you to get to that outcrop. Now. He thrust one of his strange tools into my hand. It was a metal rod, about 2 feet long, with a copper coil at one end and a sharpened, stake-like point at the other. It hummed faintly, a clean, pure vibration that was the absolute antithesis of the sickening thrum coming from the circ. "What is this?" I asked, my hand trembling as I held it. "A grounding rod. A physical anchor to this world's fundamental resonance. When I activate the main device, the fracture's defensive pulse will try to unmake things. That rod, driven into the ground, will create a small, stable field around you. It will be your only protection. Your deep familiarity with this place, your own resonance, will amplify its effect. You are not just a guide, Mr. Thorne. You are the best possible anchor I could have hoped for." The idea was insane. My life depended on a magic wand, while he fought a wound in reality with a ghost hunting machine. But looking at the pulsing, shimmering horror below, and feeling the ghosts of my past clawing at my mind, I had no other choice but to trust the madman. Clutching the rod, I scrambled towards the outcrop, my legs feeling like lead. The whispers intensified, screaming at me to stop, to lie down, to give up. A vision of my cabin flashed before my eyes, its roof caved in, its walls covered in the same sickly green mold that was growing inside the distortion. I gritted my teeth, focusing on Finch's words. Focus on the physical, the sharp edge of a rock under my hand, the burn of the thin air in my lungs, the solid weight of the copper, wound rod. I reached the outcrop, a flat shelf of rock overlooking the cirque. "Now, Finch!" I yelled, my voice raw. "Drive it in," he commanded. I lifted the rod and slammed its point down with all my strength. It sank a foot into a crack in the granite, with a sound like a tuning fork being struck. A faint, pale blue light shimmered around me, and the whispers in my head receded, pushed back to a dull murmur. The crushing pressure on my chest eased. It was working. "Shh!" Finch bellowed. He threw a switch on his device. The 3 dishes on the resonator swiveled to face the shimmering bubble. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sound unlike anything I have ever heard erupted from the machine. It was not a blast or a roar, but a single, impossibly pure musical note that seemed to vibrate in the very structure of my atoms. It was a sound of pure order, of cosmic certainty. The effect on the fracture was immediate and catastrophic. The shimmering bubble recoiled as if struck, its surface rippling violently. The sickly colors within it swirled into a vortex of oily blackness. The low, guttural hum of the fracture rose in pitch to a piercing shriek of rage and pain. Then it fought back. It didn't send a wave of energy. It did something far worse. It focused its attention, its full, malevolent intelligence, on Finch. I saw him stumble, his hands flying to his temples, his calm, controlled facade shattered. A look of pure agony crossed his face. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with a terror that dwarfed my own. The landscape around Finch began to warp. The ground at his feet seemed to liquefy, Swirling like muddy water, the resonator, his weapon of order, began to decay. A rust, like corrosion, spread across its non-reflective surface, and one of the copper coils on its arms unwound like a dying snake. The fracture wasn't just showing him visions, it was manifesting them. It was pulling the failures he was seeing in his mind out into the real world.
Finch!
I screamed, helpless from my protective circle. He was on his knees now, his eyes wide with horror, staring at something in front of him that I couldn't see. He was lost, drowning in a sea of his own personal hell. The pure note from the resonator faltered, becoming discordant and weak. The fracture pulsed triumphantly, the shimmering distortion expanding, its edge creeping closer to the failing machine. It had won the first exchange. It had broken its attacker. Then, with a final, agonizing shriek, the central core of the resonator cracked. A plume of black, acrid smoke poured from the fissure. The pure note died, replaced by the triumphant, deafening roar of the fracture. The blue light protecting me flickered and went out. The whispers, the pressure, the nausea. It all came flooding back, 100 times stronger than before. Finch collapsed onto his side, unmoving. The resonator was broken. The shimmering, expanding wound in the world was less than 30 yards away. And there was nothing between it and me but a terrified man with a useless rifle. With the resonator's death, the fracture's roar of triumph became a symphony of madness. The world dissolved into a cacophony of psychic noise. The whispers of my past were no longer whispers. They were a howling, mob screaming my failures into the core of my being. The pressure was a physical weight, crushing me to the rock, and the very granite beneath my hands felt like it was turning to sand. I was going to die here. My body would be unmade like the deer, my mind shattered into a million pieces. My rifle lay beside me, a pathetic toy. This was it. The end of Elias Thorne, a man who thought he knew the mountains. A wave of despair washed over me, so profound it almost felt peaceful. I could just let go, let the noise consume me. But as the vision of my dead brother's face swam before my eyes, something else rose up alongside the fear. It was a hot, stubborn spark of anger. This thing, this wrongness, was using my life against me. It was twisting the memory of my brother, the sorrow of my marriage, the professional shame of a client's fall. But those things were not all I was. They were moments, scars on a life lived. They were not the life itself. My life was the sting of pine needles on my face during a blizzard. It was the taste of coffee boiled over a morning fire. It was the precise weight and balance of my rifle, the satisfying thunk of an axe splitting dry lodgepole pine, the silent understanding that passed between me and a bull elk across a misty meadow at dawn. My life was the mountains, and this thing was an intruder in my home. Finch's method had failed. He had tried to fight the sour note with a louder, pure note from outside. He tried to impose order. But you can't impose order on the bitter roots. You have to be a part of its existing order. You have to speak its language. The fracture was a disease, but I was part of the mountain's immune system. Finch had called me an anchor. He had no idea how right he was. With a groan, I pushed myself up. My limbs felt like they were moving through setting concrete. I ignored the useless rifle and reached for the grounding rod I had driven into the rock. It was still warm to the touch, humming with a faint, residual energy. I pulled it free. It felt solid, real. Holding the rod like a spear, I turned to face the expanding, shimmering wound. I took a step. The fracture focused on me. The psychic roar intensified, trying to blast me into submission. It showed me my own body turning to stone, my skin cracking like the deer's. It showed me the mountains themselves crumbling into dust around me. I took another step. I closed my eyes and shut out the visions of fear. Instead, I filled my mind with my own truths. I remembered the exact map of every game trail within a 50-mile radius. I pictured the face of every client I had ever guided, the good and the bad. I recalled the specific sound the wind makes coming over Trapper Peak in January. I focused on the feeling of the sun on my face after a week of rain, the smell of damp earth in the spring, the weight of a full pack at the start of a long journey. These were not just memories, they were my resonance, my frequency. This was my song. I took a third step, and a fourth. I was walking towards the heart of the storm, armed with nothing but the sum of my life. And a strange thing happened. The closer I got, the weaker the fracture's assault became. The howling mob in my head quieted to a confused murmur. The crushing pressure lessened. The shimmering bubble, which had been expanding with arrogant confidence, stopped. Its surface began to flicker, its oily colors churning with uncertainty. It was like a predator that had only ever hunted sheep suddenly finding itself face to face with a wolf. It didn't know how to fight me. I wasn't an external force to be repelled. I was an internal truth to be reckoned with. From the corner of my eye, I saw Finch stir. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. He saw me, a simple mountain guide, walking into the jaws of a reality-eating monster, and he saw the monster falter. A desperate understanding dawned in his eyes. He crawled to the smoking, ruined resonator. He couldn't fix it, but he could break it further. With a grunt of effort, he ripped a panel from the cracked central core, exposing a tangle of wires and crystalline components. He grabbed 2 severed cables, his hands shaking. "Thorn," he croaked, his voice raw.
It can't reconcile you. Keep pushing.
I didn't need his encouragement. I was 20 feet from the edge of the distortion now. I could feel its cold, alien wrongness, but I could also feel it shrinking from me, from the simple, powerful truth of my belonging. I raised the grounding rod, not as a weapon, but as a declaration. I am here. This is my place.
No.
Finch screamed, and he slammed the 2 cables together. It wasn't a pure note that erupted from the resonator this time. It was a blast of raw, uncontrolled energy, a shriek of dying machinery and tortured physics. It was pure chaos. This blast of artificial chaos struck the wavering fracture at the exact same moment my mind was screaming its anthem of natural order. The 2 impossibly opposite forces, the assertion of what is and the fury of what is not, created a paradox that the SAR note could not survive. The shimmering bubble did not pop. It imploded. There was no sound. There was only a silent, violent lurch as reality snapped back into place. A shockwave of displaced air threw me from my feet, and I landed hard on the unforgiving rock. The world went black for a moment. When I opened my eyes, it was over. The air was still and cold and clean. The sky was the crisp, piercing blue of a high-altitude afternoon. The sickly green tint was gone. The pressure was gone. The whispers were gone. Below me, the silent cirque was just a basin of rock, silent not with a dead, pressurized emptiness, but with the profound, peaceful quiet of a place untouched by man. I lay there, every muscle screaming, my mind a hollowed-out cavern. Finch was slumped over the dead resonator, breathing in ragged gasps. He was alive. I was alive. We made our way down the mountain in silence, 2 exhausted men bound by a secret that had no words. Finch used a satellite phone to call for an extraction. A black helicopter with no markings arrived at the tree line the next morning. Before he left, he turned to me. His face was pale, his composure shattered. replaced by a weary, grudging respect. "The money is yours," he said. "It's what we call the Ridgewalkers due, a payment for services rendered beyond the terms of the contract." He paused, looking back towards the high peaks. "My methods are for incursions, foreign bodies. That thing, it had been here a long time. It had become part of the landscape. My instruments couldn't distinguish it from the mountain itself. But you could. He finally met my eyes. You didn't just silence the SAR note, Mr. Thorne. You reminded the whole damn mountain how the song is supposed to go." He boarded the helicopter, and it lifted into the sky, leaving me alone in the sudden silence. I sit in my cabin now. The envelope of money is on the table, but it feels different. It's not a payment for a job. It's an inheritance. I look out my window at the familiar peaks of the Bitterroot Range. They are the same mountains I have looked at for 23 years. But they are not the same, and neither am I. I am no longer just a guide. I am a guardian. I am a listener, forever attuned to the music of the wilderness, and forever watchful for the SAR notes that might threaten to unravel it all.